A very good morning to you, our viewers today, and welcome to our very first edition of the Breakfast Podcast. We're very delighted to have you with us here this morning. This podcast is really a platform to see us discuss and have an intimate conversation around some of the trends and policy reforms that are emerging in our own financial sector in Rwanda as well as on the continent. The topic of discussion today will be on financial compliance, more particularly anti-money laundering and the combating of financing of terrorism. We will be discussing some of the implications and opportunities around this issue for the banking sector. On the panel today, we have special guests from the banking sector and some of the key regulators, or what I would say policymakers for the financial sector. I will start off with Richard Kayibanda, the Registrar General of the Rwanda Development Board, Mr. Robin Bersto, CEO of the INM Bank, and Mr. Edward Gasore, Director of the Banking Supervision in the National Bank of Rwanda. And on my right, I'm pleased to invite Director General of Financial Sector Development at the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning, Eric Rwigamba. And finally, Mr. Tudi Moyelo, Strategic Advisor of the Rwanda Finance and the Lead Coordinator of the Kigali International Financial Center. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
And welcome to this podcast. So today we also have great, I would say, participants who are viewing in as we are live on Zoom. Some of the major banks, including Urwego, Zigama, CSS, GTZ, AB Bank, Access, Unguka. Some of those participants who are actually viewing our session today and will be contributing to this conversation. So to kick off, we would say that anti-money laundering and financing of terrorism, it's not a topic that we are hearing for the first time. The Financial Action Task Force, or what we would call the global watchdog for money laundering and terrorism financing, set clear guidelines for how countries could be able to combat this issue. And these guidelines were set in the late 1980s. And Rwanda subscribes to these international standards as a member of ESMALAG, the Eastern and Southern African Anti-Money Laundering Group. However, over the last decade, there's been an increase in some of these cases globally. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime, for example, reports an estimated cases in 1 year amounting to 2 to 5% of global GDP. That's about $800 billion in 1 year alone. And when we bring the statistics closer to home, according to the Procurement Corruption Report issued by ESMALAG in the last year, there were about 682 cases of money laundering investigation linked to corruption in some of the member countries in the region. But only 66 cases were convicted. And the Organized Crime Index, looking at organized crime in the continent, in terms of resilience against organized crime, ranked East Africa as the second least resilient region overall when it comes to organized crime. So these are hardcore facts and statistics that I feel set the tone for this conversation. And I will start with you, DG Eric, for this discussion. Rwanda recently amended the anti-money laundering law. And now Rwanda looks to criminalize and punish some of these acts for money laundering and terrorism financing. What can you say is the big change that is going to happen to our financial sector in terms of how they operate and in terms of how they combat some of these acts or incidences?
Thank you so much, Atansa. I think let me start by thanking Rwanda Finance Limited for having organized this breakfast to have an opportunity to discuss some of these serious issues. I think for now, quite a number of years, the financial sector players, they've been complying with the standards on how to combat and fight money laundering. I will call that most of the banks now and other financial institutions, they have actually compliance departments that are purely focusing on that. At the government level, we are a member of SMLAG, as we said. The central bank has got part of their supervision. They do quite a lot in terms of also reviewing and checking and controlling and seeing whether these financial institutions are complying with the standards that have been put in place as a framework to combat money laundering and fighting terrorism. When you look at the law enforcement agencies, they've also been doing a very excellent work. They have specific financial crime desks to fight, and we have a number of cases that have been prosecuted. Now, that's what we have been doing. But now, what has happened, to your point, that when we looked at the trends globally and in the region, we had to bring in teams of experts, and these are teams from IMFs and teams from SMLAG to come and be able to review our environment. So end to end, where does Rwanda stand based on best practices and also the international standards on fighting terrorism and fighting money laundering. So when the report came out, we had to check ourselves against that, and a number of recommendations were put forward for us to address. And it's from that we realized that we need to amend our money laundering law to be sure that it complies very well with international standards. And that required also that we needed to establish an organization that would help to coordinate the whole ecosystem and all the stakeholders in terms of campaigns against money laundering and fighting terrorism. Now, and so recently, the structure, actually last week, after the approval by the cabinet, now it has been published in the government gazette, and we are going to recruit. And to give you a sense of how serious as Rwanda we are taking this, the structure, we are going to put up a team of about 32 people that are going to be every day working on this, and that is under the Financial Intelligence Center. And then what is new in this space? I think to your question now that Rwanda is progressing very well in terms of establishing the Kigali International Financial Center that Rwanda Finance is promoting. Now that the trends are showing that these guys who are doing the funny games are also gaming up their game. And now that we need to comply to international standards. So what we have got to do is to get this team from Financial Intelligence Center that will be coordinating all stakeholders. When I talk about stakeholders, let me spell them out so that people understand. It's beyond actually the financial sector. So we are looking at the banks have been doing an excellent job, but we are talking about now the casinos. We are talking about real estate agents. We are talking about actors like money transfers. We are talking about the law enforcement agents, from the investigators, prosecution to the courts. We are talking about cooperation with the regional similar institutions, that if a crime is started from one of our neighboring countries and then it crosses the border, how do we coordinate? So it is that is going to change in terms of a number of things. One, much efforts are going to be put on compliance. And compliance is the easier one. what is going to be changing is actually effectiveness of the law that will be put in place. So what FIC is going to do, one is to build the capacity of the service providers, these agents I'm talking about, the regulators. If you are a capital market authority, if you are in real estate, if you are in mining, if you are, how do you ensure that everyone, immigration, how about the judges that are going to be criminalizing these cases? So one key aspect of Financial Intelligence Center is to build, for the Financial Intelligence Center, the FIC, is actually to build the capacity of everyone. I didn't mention NGOs. A number of crimes in this space are committed through NGOs that come into different countries and pretend to be doing a good job for youth, for women, for disabilities. So the NGOs, how do we build the capacity of Rwanda Governance Board to be switched on, that if some of these crimes are committed through these NGOs, local and international, they also attract. So capacity building is going to be very important. Monitoring and the analysis on looking at of these suspicious transactions that could be either through a jewelry shop, either through an NGO, either through money transfer, either through any other organized groups. So I think that is going to be the main issue. The main focus of FIC is to build the capacity of everyone, ensure that the records are kept very well, monitoring is done, analysis is done, and where cases are suspected and there's evidence that is adequate, they'll be investigated, they'll be prosecuted, and they'll be brought to justice.
Okay, thank you so much for giving that explanation and overview. And I will now look to my left, to Edward Gasore, as a regulator that oversees the banking industry. Eric has mentioned how FIC, the Financial Intelligence Center, will be operating. How will the National Bank of Rwanda, as a regulator overseeing the banking industry, work alongside this center to be able to ensure that these standards towards financial compliance are maintained and that they are actually complied with?
Okay. Thank you, Otse. First of all, I would like to also thank Rwanda Finance Limited for giving us this opportunity and just to again speak out what are the main issues in the country and at the same time also globally. As you rightly said in the introduction, this is a key component that is not only affecting Rwanda but perhaps globally it's an issue, and therefore from the national side we need to tackle it from all angles, being the regulator, being the policymakers, and also the implementers, who are mainly the institutions that we are concerned. So from the side of the regulator, yes, we recognize this law and the effect that it will definitely bring to the financial institution. First of all, the banking sector, as Rigamba rightly said, the vulnerabilities that were indicated in 2018, the assessment that was made, the banking sector was quite significant, and the main that posed the main threat. That includes again the main services that are being provided by the financial institutions, who are mainly banks. You find that there are a lot of vulnerabilities around the service provision, and what you find in most of the banking sector, of course, as maybe my colleague will rightly say, what are these services that are being provided, but you would find basically financial transactions provide a lot of vulnerabilities that would render non-compliance in any case. But as rightly said, I think we would like to recognize that a lot has been done from the side of the policy, including putting up in place in a law, and also putting up a financial institution, a financial intelligence center that would ensure at least there's that collaboration, there's effectiveness in terms of monitoring, there's effectiveness in terms of investigations and collaborating with other stakeholders who are mainly police and judiciary. However, what we would like to again bring out clearly in terms of the banking sector is that we have recognized quite significant improvement in terms of the way banks have structured themselves, and again aligning to the policy that has been put in place, the like of the law. So the central bank, what has done mainly is to put up policy measures again that to reinforce the law, basically to touch on the sectors, the specific sectors, including banks. What we have done as a central bank, again, we have issued several laws, regulations to implement the law, and mainly this is to provide guidance in terms of how would the banks effectively implement the law and also effectively comply with the international standards. At the same time, also with a law that would be criminalizing offenses that would be coming from the ML. And again, what we have done at the central bank again is to effectively to conduct the assessment to show how the sector is well prepared. And to a good surprise is that, as Erika mentioned, we have had several and key positive changes, including the governance from the side of most of the institutions. There have been increased and improved governance, and again there are areas that we have also seen significantly, which is in the line with the law. For example, on putting up preventive measures, and again procedures, basically to drive them through controls and monitoring of these suspected and suspicious transactions that would come through the financial institutions. I think what is the major improvement that we have seen, and again alongside the law and what would be again the major improvement alongside the Financial Intelligence Center that has been already established, is the collaboration in terms of how would the banks collaborate with the FIC. And what you see going back in 2018 when the assessment was indicated, there wasn't again exactly an effective structure in which there was monitoring and effectively investigate criminals and all these related crimes. However, I think it's now going to be a good stepping stone for which most of the institutions will be again complying. I think the basic and then the underlying factor within which we are operating is the trust, because most of financial institutions need to build trust, and the only way to build trust is to have these effective tools, effective strong controls in place that would at least prevent the crystallization of all these crimes that would be coming through the financial institutions. I think that's the good thing that we have seen, and basically we would continue to leverage on the strength and the governance that has been already established, whether from the policy and the national level, and again also to the institutional level. Okay.
Thank you, Edward. And if I could get just a bit more into the specifics here, when you mention that there are in place preventative policy measures and controls, could you name just a few or even one that could give our viewers or ourselves even an example of what that entails? Yeah,
thank you very much. I think for that, what we have done, and again, we have put up a guidance. It's a directive, and it sort of provides guidance in terms of what institutions would clearly demonstrate in terms of how to prevent any likely event that would come from. And that is mainly to put up such policies in place, for example, customer due diligence, whereby on onboarding any customer, you would really need to know who is your customer who's coming to this institution. And that's the that's the critical moment at which you need to have the preventions. Because if you are onboarding a bad guy, rest assured tomorrow you will have a lot of particular problems in terms of transactions, and then there will be a lot of illicit transactions that will coming through the institution, which would result either again, what the eventualities of such transactions would be either suspending your particular institution, collaboration with international institutions. And again, there are other issues. For example, we have put in place where we require institutions to have a reporting mechanism in which they need to identify suspicious transactions. So from the onboarding a customer, then you need also to monitor the transaction that this customer is doing or she's doing with whether it's also a corporate, that particular institution, what is it dealing with and what is it transacting. So there's that mechanism for monitoring, which is a process that they have to have tools in place to identify, trigger out, alert what is this suspicious transaction, and therefore report that suspicious transaction again to already institution that has been established, which is the Financial Intelligence Center. That is the kind of preventive measures that we have put in place. Again, what we have also stressed and strengthened is the internal control. So we need to have internal control mechanisms to check whether to have an independent arm in terms of checking exactly whether these processes, these procedures are really working on the effectiveness. I think that's basically what we have laid down, and again what we have continuously evaluated in terms of the institution's status with regards to again compliance.
Thank you so much, and I think it's a great segue now that we'll be switching over to both Robin and Richard. And I'll start also over with Robin, hearing what Edward mentioned in terms of the controls that have been put in place to guide banking institutions on how to identify some of these cases or incidences and how to monitor and eventually report. As the custodians for most of these transactions and financial flows, what are some of the reforms or I would say measures that bankers or banking institutions are currently putting in place to be able to comply with these guidelines?
Yeah. Thank you very much, and I'll join everyone else in thanking you for putting this discussion together. It's really important. From us establishing an international finance center in the country, this is the bedrock of the foundation of that establishment is knowing that our standards meet the exacting standards that have been set up internationally. If we look to some of our international banks and their levels of non-compliance that they've had, and the fines that have been levied in terms of making them understand where they are not meeting the mark, and the fact that our criminals and organizations that are funding terrorism are evolving at a rapid. We talk about digitization within the banking sector. So are those ne'er-do-wells that are trying to launder their money through our systems. They are evolving, which means our laws, our regulations, and the standards that we measure ourselves to have to change. In terms of what the banking sector has done, number one is align ourselves to best practice globally. I think that the NBR hold us to exacting standards in that respect, from the establishment of individual compliance officers within each bank, a compliance framework that we understand that we have, establishing frameworks which we have all done. As a collective from the Rwanda Bankers Association, we are all involved in, we all get together. There's a compliance forum which corresponds regularly with the central bank, and maintains and is there to maintain those standards. If we look at software that is available now that has been updated, where there's automatic filtering that is taking place, and at the same time, and Edward touched on it, more exacting standards with regards to KYC are in place for accounts that have been opened now. But at the same time, the entire industry has embarked on a refreshing of all of their customers that they have on board, which is an ongoing process. So more of a process than an actual event, making us more and more compliant. We are fortunate that we embark our journey in a country that has, from a governance point of view, quite exacting standards. I know Edward spoke about being a medium risk country, but if you contextualize that and measure us against 245 other countries that are measured, we're number 41 in terms of our risk weighting across the globe, and we rank above countries like Singapore, Switzerland, Australia. So it's a good starting point for us to begin this journey on, and puts us in at a level where we can measure ourselves against OECD countries, which is an important aspect when we're looking at the direction we're taking with regards to attracting people to the country.
Thank you so much for touching upon that, and more specifically on the KYC, Know Your Customer. What does this process, or you mentioned it's a process, can you take us through the process currently, for example, on KYC for banking institutions?
It starts with the basics in terms of establishing the identity of your customer, be they an individual or a corporate customer. On the corporate side, which is far more risky, you have to unwrap the organization. So not only understanding who the shareholders are, but the ultimate beneficial owners of the organization are. And that is a process that we have to go through. So I know that there's oftentimes customers complain that we're asking intrusive questions. We ask a lot more information than we would have done in the past. It goes beyond founding statements, because you could have a legal entity being a shareholder of another legal entity, and then you have to establish who that owner is. So there's a lot more that goes in that process. And then at the same time, we're now fortunate in that with a lot of automation, or as we love the buzzword, digitization, even on the compliance side, we have access to international databases which scrub those details down. So, you wouldn't know perhaps that a former minister of state is in another African country, which might even be sanctioned. If they're appearing in their personal capacity, was a politically exposed person in another country, if it's some obscure, an obscure division or entity within that country, and that allows you, by us using software to do the identification, that has a massive impact on our ability to identify at the outset who the owners are of organizations. And then also from a risk classification, all the banks classify their accounts, which means that those that are higher risk are subjected to a more thorough and more frequent assessment. So anyone who is a high risk is then subject to an annual review of their status, their position, etc. And the same with businesses as well. So it means there's a lot more due diligence that is done at the outset, but that also allows us to filter out any potential risks that we might encounter.
Thank you so much, Robin. And I'll pose the next question to Richard, as Secretary of the Rwanda Development Board. There was a poll that was recently conducted by the UN Office for Drugs and Crimes, and it polled a number of respondents basically to identify some of the, I would say, channels through which a lot of this money laundering or financing of terrorism is conducted through. And what came out as most of the popular channels were the use of nominees or associates in the registration of companies, as well as the use of offshore jurisdictions, or what we now tend to call the tax haven. Now, as an institution that has the mandate to oversee registration of businesses in general in Rwanda, what are some of the controls that you are putting in place for this due diligence to enable your staff, your own staff, and the country at large to be able to at least to comply with some of these standards?
Okay, thank you for that, and I will echo what my predecessor have said in terms of thanking Rwanda Finance for organizing this, this session, which is an important session as we endeavor to set the ground for KIFC. And going back to your question, I have to say that we have also to follow suit in terms of what is going on in ensuring that we remain a country that is compliant with standards. My fellow panelists have tackled most of these standards, but again, at the level of company registry and the other entities registration, which is actually the starting point when people want to enter the business arena, they would choose one of the business forms. There is a number of them, and some of them are companies. Very soon we will be registering partnerships. And when you look at how some of these are structured, my colleague Robin has tackled some of them. You have an entity being owned by other entity. That entity is also owned by another entity. So understandably, at the level of company registration, we need to ensure that we go far and make sure that we capture the information that would enable us to know who is the legitimate owner or the legitimate beneficial owner behind that channel. To do this, we need capacity building for the staff that are handling these files. It was mentioned by Eric. We need enabling legal frameworks. On the aspect of institutional framework, the institution is there. Financial Intelligence Center is there, but also the Office of the Registrar General, or RDB, which is an institution that hosts this department, and the other institutions are there. But we need legal frameworks that enable us to be able to achieve this big mandate. So I would say that currently we have a legal framework that does not go far into details in terms of what information that we are required to collect when registering these entities. But we are also working on which approaches we should take to ensure that we comply with, because this has been even raised in different assessments reports, that yes, we are capturing the information, but there is one aspect that is not being captured. So we are trying to look at what is the best approach to capture this information to ensure that those entities that are coming from tax havens with the veil that does not enable us to know who is the legitimate beneficial owner. So we are trying to see what is the best approach to get that information in terms of policy, but more importantly, regulatory framework. Because if you don't have a legal framework that enables you to collect that information, then it would not be easy. I know that under the new anti-money laundering and combating financing of terrorism, we have this obligation to not only collect that information, but also keep it updated and updated in a timely manner. So all those requirements that we need to figure out what are the best mechanisms to ensure that we abide by those obligations. So I would say that we are at the stage of capacity building in terms of trainings of the staff that handles these files, but also reviewing the enabling legal framework. We are working on the Companies Act to see what are the provisions that we need to add to ensure that we achieve this purpose of ensuring that we are not red flagged as not complying with these obligations of ensuring that no criminal groups or criminal persons laundering proceeds from their crimes through the legal entities that are registered with us.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'll now turn it over to Tudi on my right. Rwanda Finance has been established as the agency to develop and promote Rwanda as an international financial center. And with this, this means that Rwanda will now be ranked competitively against other international financial centers, be it on the continent and globally. Now, as a strategic advisor to Rwanda Finance and the coordinator of this initiative, and also a former banker yourself who has worked in some of these international jurisdictions such as Luxembourg and Singapore, could you shed light on some of the best practices you have seen regarding, for example, beneficial ownership or know your customer, some of these practices that these jurisdictions are putting in place to be able to comply with these standards?
Thank you, Hortense, for the question. I will start, like my fellow panelists said, to grade the team of Rwanda Finance and to also give a little bit of context for this discussion. As you have said, I will say 1 year ago, I was still in Singapore, and thinking about Rwanda as an international financial center was, I believe, more like a dream. And talking to my colleagues in the financial industry there, or even in Luxembourg, they will never imagine that Rwanda in a so short time could be looking at becoming an international financial center. So one is to appreciate the work that has been done, not only by the team of Rwanda Finance, but also by all the stakeholders. And we have a few here. We have to appreciate those long consultations, those long debates that we had on how to improve and upscale the framework of the financial sector in Rwanda. So it is very important to understand that when we are talking about our international financial center, we are not talking about something new. We are talking about those existing banks, existing regulators that are now upgrading themselves to be attractive and more competitive to new international players. So the key here, to go back to your question, is to really understand that we will now be being exposed to new type of clients, to new type of investors, and their complexity will be more than what we used to, I would say, to know. And when we talk about AML CFT, we must understand what we want to achieve. We want to keep our financial sector clean. When we say clean, it means all those proceeds that will come from tax crime, from fraud, from drugs, from robbery, from corruption will be a no-go in Rwanda. That's very important. And our financial center will be a member-based financial center, which means that we will not open our door to everyone. So we will be selective. And this selection can be effective only if we are all playing our role, from the policymakers that are setting the tone with the regulation, the central bank, the registrar general, the banks, and all those other players that are part of the ecosystem. We have seen FATF, we have seen Esmala coming here, giving their report. We are addressing them. We are addressing them not only as a financial center in Africa, but as a financial center looking at the best standards. And what are those best standards? This is your question, basically. It all starts with individual. Because end of the day, we can implement all the laws, all the regulation, but it will go down to people. How are we ready in terms of capacity building, in terms of skills, to actually understand the new type of transactions that will happen here in Rwanda? That's the key question. And those financial centers, if there is something common to all of them, is the level of investment made in human resources. The level of investment made to make sure that all players of the financial center, being bankers, being all those regulated institutions, understand that we have a common goal, which is to keep the center clean. So I have an ask actually today. And the ask is not to be shy to go the extra mile. Not to be shy to have a reference when we talk about AML CFT. What I mean by that is the following. If you look at what we have in terms of professional education, there is no training institute in Rwanda that will give to all bankers the same level of understanding. We are very fortunate to have banks that are investing directly into their staff internally to have them at a certain level. But we as a country, we should now go this extra mile to make sure that we have all the same level of understanding. And this is the strength of those countries. You said Luxembourg, we say Singapore, we can say Jersey, we can name a few of them. But when you talk to a banker in any of those countries, the way they will answer to you and the way they will do their due diligence will be the same. We need to get to that level. I suppose that you will have more questions, but really the first ask today, if you want to be international, is all to I will say to speak and to say the same thing, and to really understand that you are getting into something new where the complexity will be more than what we used to have today. This will be my first answer.
Thank you so much, Tudi, for that. And I realize that we're actually coming to the close of our time in our session, but I think I would like to now bring it all the way full circle to Eric, representing the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning. Now, as the main line ministry that oversees the financial sector, and following up on Tudi's last remark regarding seeing that we are all on the same page and same level of understanding as regards financial compliance, what are some of the measures or some of the initiatives that are going to come through in terms of upskilling and sensitizing our local institutions and professionals around this matter to be able to sustain the progress that has already been made?
Right. Yeah. I think the first measure that he has that's going to be very critical is actually getting FIC well staffed with the right people and with the right skills. One of the key business line in FIC, in the Financial Intelligence Center, is actually the capacity building team, which is going to really be our foundational kind of pillar to get the regulators to be able to teach them, to help them, to coordinate them, to be able to understand this subject matter, such that then the regulators work with the service providers to now be able to speak the same language Tudi was talking about. And what is important, we are going to go beyond financial players or service providers. So I mentioned the estate agent. We want to see if you are an agent selling a property in Nyarutarama, you need to be switched on in terms of who is the potential buyer, where the money coming from. How do you track that if this transaction is happening somewhere? I mentioned about NGOs. I talked about dealers in precious stones and metals. I talked about capital market players. I want to talk about cooperatives. So the work of this FIC, the first step is to actually ensure that all those people, all those players in the ecosystem are well prepared. But now the other component about it is how do we use different channels and media to communicate the message that MLC monitoring and combating financing terrorism, it has serious implication to individuals themselves. If this becomes a common sense that this is a serious aspect of our of every household, because these are issues that if you are directly or indirectly involved in any case, you'll be prosecuted. So if people get to understand that, then you go to corporates, to go to cooperatives, then people understand that if you're a financial institution, and I think we are like that, they know. For financial institutions, they know that if you don't comply, the consequences are just not good for the institution itself. But we need to also to understand that this has serious implications for the country and the economy. So the awareness at different layers of the population of the country are going to be very key. But as we think about all these people who are doing wrong, who commit crime, they're also planning. And so that's why it's very important that the whole ecosystem has got the framework to combat, to monitor, to assess, to report, and serious measures also, fines and penalties also have been put in the money laundering law. So it's going to, what it requires, I think, from our point of view of the government, is to get everyone to understand and appreciate what his role, what is her role. As the ecosystem, if all actors are switched on, we believe it's going to be easier.
Okay. Thank you so much. And I believe we just have a few minutes to end this session. I would open up the floor to if there are any questions from any of our viewers. And if not, I would say to, as a closing remark from everyone on this panel, maybe I'll start with you, Robin, as the main implementers of these financial sector, I would say, or being a banker and a banking institution yourself, what are some of the closing remarks you would put across for this going ahead?
Having worked in a number of markets, and this is, I'm going to lay a challenge to my fellow members of the Bankers Association. Lack of KYC controls is not a competitive advantage. And let me explain that to you. We set rules and regulations. I've worked in territories where you set compliance standards. Customers say, I don't want to meet those exacting standards. And they go to another bank where the standards are not as high. If we do that, we weaken the entire system. So I leave that as the one thing that I say. It's the lack of proper controls is not a competitive advantage.
Okay, thank you so much. And Edward, what would be the closing remarks you would have for this conversation around financial compliance?
I think what my colleague Dudu said, I think we don't take this for granted. As a matter of fact, Rwanda's reputation has to be maintained, and again, if we're to anchor ourselves as competitive, then we have to set those standards, and we have to make sure that those standards are effective and they're well complied with. So on the banking side, I think what we have said as a regulator, we have already put in place some mechanisms in terms of preventing. Maybe the other aspect that we need to, and again what I would, is then in most cases, if there's non-compliance, of course there are mechanisms of ensuring enforcement. Mm-hmm. Again, what is good, again from the side of the sector, is that we have already issued a sanction, regulation, a regime. In most cases, if you're non-compliant, again with all these mechanisms that were put in place, you will be held accountable, and at the same time you will be penalized for that. So from the standard point of it, and again to keep that image, at the same time the trust and stability within the financial sector, we have to comply at the same time with international standards, as well as to ensure that we have that level that is very competitive, and again also to attract potential investors. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Richard.
Thank you. Throughout the conversation, we need, this is a matter of the image of the country. This is a matter of the competitiveness of the country. So we may have laws and regulations into place. We may have institutions into place, but if we learn from others' experience, even if it's a bad experience, we can learn from their mistakes and then be able to move forward. So that's why I'm saying that we may have laws in place, we may have institutions in place, but if we fail at the level of implementation, then we have missed a big point. So let's ensure that this is made everybody's duty to ensure that we abide by the rules and the regulations, and we make it part of our daily life. As some of my colleagues said, this is something that has an implication to a single, not only to a country, but also to individual citizens. So if we don't own this, then we would not have made it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And over to you, Tudi, as well. What would be some of the closing remarks you would have?
So my closing remarks will be very simple. Number one, this is our project. This is everyone's project, KFC. So the duty to comply with those rules should apply to everyone. We talk about FIC, we talk about suspicious transaction reporting. That should fall all the way to any citizen of the country, because our brand, our success depends on how the country is being perceived. The good news, I will say, in November, I'm very confident that we will see new players coming in the market. That's the very good news. It is now putting pressure on us to be ready. And in the specific area of AML CFT, let's do our best to be ready. I know that Rwanda Finance, for example, has negotiated with certain professional centers how to get access to training at a special discount. Okay, I'm not here to do any promotion, but if you have professional listening today and wants to have access to those type of training, please come and discuss with the staff of Rwanda Finance, because we believe it is important to have this international exposure. And for the rest, everyone has said it, we are in line, and the center will be successful and open very soon. So that's my closing remark.
Okay. Thank you so much. And I know you have mentioned as the overall remark, but I would say what would be a challenge that you would make for everyone listening into this call as the ministry overseeing this financial compliance? What would you give as a challenge to everyone to take on in implementing these new standards?
I think one, at all stages and at all levels, there's no room for non-compliance. So all actors, as Rwandans, but also from our side, I think they should pick it quite early enough that in Rwanda, and in the context of the governance of the country, from the leadership, and also in the context of the International Finance Center, we do not want to create any room for non-compliance. And the compliance is going to be one thing, but I think the most important aspect of what we are aspiring to do is actually effectiveness of this legal framework. And so the earlier everyone picks it up, the better, because we don't have any option. This is a global threat, and we want to play at the big stage. So the tone is set clearly from the leadership of the country. There are not going to be any room for non-compliance at any level. And regardless of how much investment you want to let into the country, I'm afraid we don't have many options, so there's no room for non-compliance. And so that's the tone, and that's the part of our DNA as a system and as the center that we want to build our economy on as a foundation.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being with us during this session. And I think I do not have to say much. Everyone has summarized the main points for this conversation and discussion. And I know we did not get a chance to actually hear from our viewers, but this is not where the conversation ends. And I encourage you all to please reach out to any of the stakeholders that you have seen on the panel today with any questions and areas of clarification that you would need. And as Rwanda Finance, we are spearheading this initiative known as the Breakfast Podcast to be able to engage in these conversations. And as the agency that will be promoting more and more of these conversations, we are also opening up the floor to any of our viewers to ask us any questions and to pop in at our offices to be able to get clarifications on most of these reforms that are happening. So from the team here at Rwanda Finance and from my panelists on board, I wish to thank you and wish you a good morning and a good day. Thank you.